Okay, we are in a 3-week series that I've titled Questions for God, a study in Habakkuk. And in this book, Habakkuk is having a conversation with God, and we get to listen into this in depth conversation. Habakkuk is a prophet who lived during a period of national revival, followed by a period of spiritual decline. So Habakkuk is watching the decline that's happening. He's watching Judah drift away from God, drifting away morally as well, and he's writing about the things that are taking place. So in verse 1, Habakkuk is burdened with a message from God. And this message was heavy in its weight because the message was essentially an announcement of coming judgment on Judah, a prophecy of a terrible execution that was to be made by an even more terrible nation. So in verses 2 through 4, Habakkuk is asking God why he is allowing all this evil and wickedness and not doing anything about it. He's looking at all the violence and cruelty, the oppression and injustice going on around him in the nation of Judah, and he is literally grieving. What Habakkuk sees, he feels is unbearable. He says, there's no law, there's no order, no justice, no peace, just a bunch of defiance, conflict, division, and destruction. And he's wondering where God is and why he was delaying judgment on these people. Habakkuk is asking, why, God, are you tolerating this? Why aren't you doing something? Why are you allowing terrible things to happen to good people? Habakkuk feels outnumbered and overpowered by the wickedness and the unrighteousness around him, and he's tormented in his confusion. So he cries out to God for help. And many of us are asking some of these same questions today. Why, God, are you allowing all this evil and senseless violence? Every time we turn on the news, there's another mass shooting, another killing of an unarmed black man, another Amber Alert. Why, Lord, do you allow people to be so evil and even triumph while doing so? Why do you allow the rich to oppress the poor? Why are you letting these things happen? Why are you not responding? All these whys are building up inside, and like Habakkuk, we begin crying out in agony. How long, oh God, must we call for help? How long, Lord, before you save us, right? How long, Lord, must I call out for help on behalf of my family, my sick child, my sick mother or father? Why aren't you doing anything, God? Why aren't you moving? How long will I be single? How long will I have to wait for children? How long, Lord, must I call out for help in my marriage? How long, Lord, will I continue to have this broken heart? How long will I continue to feel this sorrow? And like Habakkuk, many of us are struggling to have hope in a broken and wicked world. Many of us are disappointed, are sick, hurting, are struggling with bad news. Like Habakkuk, many of us are desperate for change. Many of us are trying to understand how God can be good when life is not. Like Habakkuk, many of us are experiencing a crisis of belief in God. But listen, don't let your circumstances and what's going on around you or to you undermine your faith. When God does not move when we want Him to, fix things when we want Him to, change things when we want Him to, do the things that we want Him to, we tend to conclude that God is not omnipotent, that He's not all powerful, that He's not loving, that He's not compassionate towards me. But don't let whatever difficulty or issue you're facing or whatever is happening in the world around you, whatever's going on in your family or with your health, don't let any of that distort your view of who God is. God is omnipotent. God is compassionate. God is loving. He is a just God. Don't allow your crisis of belief to cause you to wander or become hard-hearted towards God or become distant from God. Whatever you're wrestling with, whatever tragedy or trauma you're experiencing, don't walk away. Look up. Stop looking out. Stop looking around. Look up and connect with God. Go deep with your Heavenly Father in the middle of what you're going through. And so the Lord responds to Habakkuk and tells him in verses 5 through 11 to look around and prepare to be amazed. Something is about to take place and it will blow your mind. And so we see here that God will answer and respond to those who seek him and listen. And we've seen this before. Remember Job? After he lost everything, he kept crying out to God, kept seeking him, and God responded. Paul wrestled with a thorn in his flesh and other trials, and after crying out and seeking God, God responded. Mary, Mary was pregnant and she questioned, how could this be? I'm a virgin. And God responded. When you are sincere and seek God with all your heart and you listen, he will respond. You know why? Because he's a loving God and he is so personal. And in verse 6, the Lord proceeds to tell Habakkuk that he was sending the Babylonians. Some translations say the Chaldeans, referring to the people who lived in southern Babylonia. But God says, I'm sending the cruel and ruthless Babylonians who march throughout the earth, devouring nations and conquering their land left and right as my instrument of judgment on these sinful people. And so God tells Habakkuk that he's going to use people even more evil and ruthless than Judah to rebuke and bring them back to the Lord. And so he goes on to describe the Babylonians as being extremely fierce and ferocious. He says they make up their own laws, carry out their own justice in a very cruel manner. Whatever they do just based on their own will. They do whatever they want with no regard, no mercy. Everything they do is with violence and fury. It says that the government despises the poor, oppresses righteous people. It says in verse 8 that their horses run like the wind. They come out of nowhere, attack like bloodthirsty wolves and vultures ascending down on their prey. They literally come to kill, steal, and destroy. They mock and laugh at kings and rulers that try to oppose them. The Lord also tells Habakkuk in verse 11 that the Babylonians would come and overwhelm the land of Judah and then claim because they conquered Israel that their gods were too strong for the God of Israel. So God essentially warns Habakkuk that, look, buddy, you think it's bad now, brace yourself because things are going to get even worse. And he says that judgment would be terrible and dreadful, and he was essentially going to use their enemies to topple them because of their injustice and the fact that they've chosen other gods before him. And so, of course, that really wasn't the response that Habakkuk thought was coming, and that's not what he wanted to hear. But that's the thing, right, about listening and surrendering to God. It's usually a different plan or answer than what we thought it was going to be. And the challenge is, will we still trust him and his plan, right? So Habakkuk hears this response and is feeling like, God, I don't really like this plan. I'm having a hard time trusting this plan, right? But we know, we can tell by Habakkuk's response in verse 12 that despite that, he stays in faith, right? Even when he's having the hardest time trusting God's plan, he stays in faith. So as you are wrestling with God and his plan this week, I want to encourage you to stay in faith and declare, I can trust God with this. Even when you don't feel like trusting him, when it doesn't feel good, what's going on in your life, declare continually throughout this week, I can trust God with this. Okay? In verse 12, we see Habakkuk is in worship. And then starting in verse 13, Habakkuk asks another series of questions. Essentially, he's like, okay, Lord, this makes no sense. If I'm sinful and I see the Babylonians and what they're doing, and it's terrible and dreadful for me, God, you're holy. Like, how can you see this and tolerate this and let this happen? God, if this is hard for me, how are you not taking action, right? But Habakkuk is still humbly seeking God for answers. So listen, God understands your pain, your doubt, your anxiety, and he welcomes your questions. I am so convinced that he would rather have you shout at him in tears than walk away from him in sorrow. Okay? So, in your crisis of belief, don't deny your doubts. Don't run away from God. Instead, let your doubts drive you to God. Okay? Look up and write this down. Honesty with God can lead to greater trust in God. Okay? Honesty with God will lead to greater trust in God. It can be scary to open up, scary to go deep with God. It may seem a little awkward, uncomfortable, but Habakkuk, he doesn't deny or avoid his feelings. He doesn't coast. He doesn't stuff. He doesn't beat around the bush. He literally goes to God with what was on his heart. So this week, have a personal encounter with God. Cry out to him. Seek him. Reflect on his character. I love how Habakkuk reflects in verse 12. He describes God as my rock. And Moses, too, had a lot of questions for God during his life. But in Deuteronomy 32, 3 through 4, Moses says, I will proclaim the name of the Lord. Oh, praise the greatest of our God. He is the rock. His works are perfect, and all his ways are just. A faithful God who does no wrong, upright and just is he. God is the rock. In the midst of it all, in the middle of it all, he is our stability. Whatever is troubling you, don't let your heart drift away. Cry out to God. Seek him. That's worship. Worship is not just about singing songs or going to church. Worship is meeting with God and drawing near to him. Remember, Jesus wrestled with the Father's plan as well. In Matthew 26, Jesus was wrestling. He prayed 3 times, Father, if there's any other way, if there's any other plans that you have besides this cross, let's go with that plan. But ultimately, not my will, let your will be done. Jesus trusted the Father's plan, and we can too. We can trust his plan even when it's difficult. Declare with me out loud, I can trust God with this. I can trust God with this. In my limited understanding, none of this makes sense. I'm not sure how it's going to end. I'm disappointed. This does not feel good, but I can trust God with this.